Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. India has approved 2 COVID-19 vaccines for restricted emergency usage. Yesterday we had discussed that the Drugs Controller General of India has recommended the approval of 2 COVID-19 vaccines. So accordingly, the parent organization of the DCGI, that is the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, which falls under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, has officially approved 2 vaccines for restricted emergency usage. These 2 vaccines are Covishield and Covaxin. Covishield has been developed by the Oxford University by tying up with pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca. This Oxford vaccine has been mass produced by the Serum Institute of India, which is headquartered at Pune, and it is said to be one of the world's largest vaccine producers. The approval that has been granted to the Oxford vaccine is on the basis of the safety and efficacy data that the Serum Institute of India has shared with the regulators. See, in India, phase 3 trials of the Oxford vaccine is still currently going on, but all the safety and efficacy data has already been shared by the Serum Institute of India with the regulators. But however, the efficacy data of phase 3 trials has still not been made available in the public domain. And while granting this approval to the Oxford vaccine, the Indian regulators have also relied upon the data from the phase 3 clinical trials that were conducted in United Kingdom and in Brazil. As per these trials, the Oxford vaccine has displayed an efficacy of around 70.4%, and it is on this basis that the Central Drug Standard Control Organization has granted restricted emergency use approval to Covishield. So kindly remember that the efficacy data from the ongoing phase 3 trials in India is yet to be shared in the public domain. The other vaccine that has been approved is Covaxin, which has been indigenously developed by the Hyderabad-based Bharat Biotech by tying up with the National Institute of Virology, which is a part of the Indian Council of Medical Research. This indigenously developed vaccine is also undergoing phase 3 trials, but the company is yet to prove its efficacy, and this efficacy data is not available in the public domain. So considering that very limited efficacy data is available with regard to Covaxin as compared to Covishield of Oxford, the regulatory authorities have placed even more restrictions on the usage of Covaxin. So basically, the approval that has been granted to Covishield and Covaxin, they are slightly different. Oxford's Covishield has been approved for restricted emergency usage, whereas the approval that has been granted to Covaxin allows it to be administered only in the clinical trial mode. So the approval that has been granted to Covaxin will further allow it to be used in the clinical trial mode, and its widespread usage will be approved only after further efficacy data is made available by the company. For Covishield, there are comparable efficacy data that is available from the clinical trials that have been conducted in other countries. But since Covaxin is an indigenous vaccine, such data is not available, and hence the regulators have placed further restrictions on the usage of Covaxin. But however, Bharat Biotech's Covaxin has a couple of advantages for India. The first advantage is that it is a whole virion vaccine that has been developed by using an inactive strain of the SARS coronavirus 2. It means that the vaccine contains the whole version of the virus that has been inactivated through a unique culture that has been developed by the National Institute of Virology. Since the whole inactive virus will be injected, it might possibly help us to fight against any mutation, including the new UK strain that has been spreading rapidly around the world. Because see, other vaccines such as Covishield, they only partially target the virus, and they particularly focus on the spike protein structure of the virus. So in that case, if the virus itself is able to mutate, and if it is able to make genetic changes to its spike protein structure, then these vaccines might become ineffective against the newer mutations. But however, Indian researchers believe that the usage of the whole inactivated virus in India's indigenous Covaxin will help us to deal with any possible mutation, because the whole inactive virus that is injected will trigger our immune response, and possibly it might help us to combat any possible mutations in the spike protein structure. See, when any vaccine is being approved, there are three parameters that the regulators would be looking for. First and foremost, they would look for the safety of the vaccine. They would like to know if the vaccine is triggering any adverse allergic reactions which might pose a threat to the life of the recipient. Once the safety of the vaccine is proven, then the regulators look for its immunogenicity. It means that the regulators are looking to find out whether the vaccine is able to trigger an immune response in the recipient. Once the safety and the immunogenicity of the vaccine is established, then the regulators will look for the effectiveness of the vaccine in order to establish how effective is the immune response against the disease. So in the case of Covishield and Covaxin, both the vaccines have been able to prove their safety and immunogenicity. Despite a few isolated cases of adverse reactions, by and large, both the vaccines have been deemed to be safe, and both the vaccines have managed to register an immune response. But Oxford's Covishield has been able to display an efficacy of 70.4%, whereas the efficacy of Covaxin is still not very clear as the data is not made publicly available. But despite the limited availability of data and despite the persisting doubts about the efficacy of these vaccines, Indian regulatory agencies have gone ahead and they have approved their restricted emergency usage by keeping in mind that the pandemic is still spreading rapidly around the world and new mutant strains have been emerging in several countries. So with this restricted emergency use approval, India would be rolling out its vaccination program, and most likely the preferred choice would be Covishield, which would be administered to 3 crore frontline workers in the coming months. This would be followed by the priority beneficiaries, that is those who are above the age of 50 years and those who suffer from comorbid conditions. And this phase of the vaccination program is expected to cover another 27 crore people. The usage of Bharat Biotech's Covaxin shall be limited only to the clinical trial mode unless and until further efficacy data is made available. And once the vaccine program is launched, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the regulatory agencies will closely monitor and follow up the vaccination drive in order to identify any possible adverse reactions. And in case of any widespread adverse events, then the regulatory authorities can even withdraw the restricted approval that they have granted. Then finally, the indigenously developed Covaxin represents another advantage for India because around 12 countries have already expressed interest, and this presents an opportunity for India to emerge as a leader in the field of vaccine development. Next, we have a related editorial on page number 6. The editorial labels the upcoming vaccine rollout of India as India's biggest ever vaccination program, and the latest approval that has been provided for 2 vaccines basically sets a precedent on the basis of which any future vaccines, especially for COVID-19, could be evaluated. Because the performance of these vaccines and the manner in which they were developed and approved provides a basis to evaluate and administer the future vaccines. The editorial also says that the COVID-19 pandemic presented an unprecedented opportunity for India to establish itself as a lead country with regard to vaccine development. Because until now, India has only been seen as the manufacturer of vaccines. It has never proven its ability to develop a vaccine from scratch, and it doesn't have established credentials as a developer of vaccines. That's the reason why the indigenous Covaxin represented an unprecedented opportunity for India. But according to the editorial, the government and the regulatory agencies, they have lost out on this opportunity because they have sidestepped and ignored a key aspect of vaccine development and vaccine testing, which is the efficacy of the vaccine. As we discussed under the previous article, the approval granted to Covaxin is on the basis of very limited data, and its vaccine efficacy data from phase 3 trials is yet to be made available. If you compare this with the approval that has been granted by other countries for vaccines such as Covishield, developed by Oxford and AstraZeneca, and for vaccines developed by Pfizer and Moderna, you will find that these companies had conducted phase 3 clinical trials within the domestic population, and emergency approvals were granted to them only after they released the efficacy data. But in the case of India, the phase 3 trials are still going on, and both Covishield and Covaxin are yet to prove their efficacy in phase 3 trials conducted within India. But however, the emergency approval granted to Covishield can be justified because the approval is based on the efficacy data drawn from the clinical trials done in UK and Brazil. AstraZeneca had shared this data with the government regulators, and it places the vaccine's efficacy at 70.4%. However, Covaxin's phase 3 trials are still going on, and sufficient reliable efficacy data is still not available. Now, this is a very crucial step in the process of vaccine development, testing and approval, because this is the very foundational basis of evidence-based medicine. See, in phase 3 trials, a type of a randomized controlled trial is conducted known as a double-blinded trial. See, in any clinical trial, there are two groups that are established. One group is known as the test group, which always receives the test drug or the test vaccine. The other is the placebo group, which is administered with only a placebo, and they are not given the real drug or the real vaccine. Then finally, the results are drawn by comparing the performance of the two groups, and this type of RCT trial provides for unbiased scientific data on its efficacy. But in a double-blinded trial, a precautionary step is added to further reduce the bias, and in such a double-blinded trial, neither the recipient nor the administrator is aware as to whether they are administering or receiving the real drug or whether they are receiving or administering the placebo. So when none of the parties are aware as to whether they are receiving the test drug or the placebo, it makes the trial more unbiased and neutral and provides more accurate scientific data for the researchers. Currently, Covaxin is in the process of conducting the double-blinded phase 3 trials, and even before the process could be completed, and even before sufficient reliable data could be made available, the regulators have gone ahead and given emergency approval to Covaxin as well, which is yet to demonstrate its efficacy as compared to Covishield, which has at least demonstrated its efficacy during its UK and Brazil trials. So without having sufficient reliable data on the efficacy of these vaccines amongst Indian population, these vaccines have been approved, and hence the editorial is critical of the government and the regulatory agencies for focusing only on the safety and the immune response and for completely ignoring the efficacy of the vaccine. The editorial calls it unethical to subject the public to these vaccines without being aware of its efficacy, and it appears that the government has hurried through the approval process, and further, the government has been very opaque in its communication with the public, and if this efficacy data is not made available in the public domain in the coming days, then it is only going to increase vaccine hesitancy amongst the public and lead to further distrust against these vaccines. See, this pandemic has already shown us how a few therapies and interventions that have been proclaimed as a solution have not really worked, and the best example would be the promotion of plasma therapy and the administration of antivirals such as remdesivir during the initial days of the pandemic. Around the world, several hospitals and doctors, they started administering antivirals, and they even placed the patients under plasma therapy, believing that these interventions were reducing the mortality rate and helping the patients to recover. While these interventions and therapies seemed to work in ideal lab conditions, they were found to be completely ineffective in the real world. So basically, these episodes provided us lessons in placing our faith on evidence-based medicine, and the same should have set a precedent for the development, testing and approval of vaccines as well. But if the approval process is hurried through, and if focus is given only to the safety and the immunogenicity of the vaccine, and if its efficacy is ignored, then such an approach is not just unethical, but it would also promote vaccine hesitancy amongst the public and lead to greater distrust against these vaccines. This would also make India lose out on this unprecedented opportunity to emerge as a leader in the field of testing and developing vaccines. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, which evaluates the Patent Amendment Rules of 2020. According to the author, the latest Patent Amendment Rules leads to the weakening of the disclosure policy, and thereby this could have a severe impact on public health. See, under patent laws, a patent is granted to any new invention in order to recognize the invention and provide ownership of this invention to the researchers or the company that has led to this invention. This ownership allows the patent holder to have a monopoly over the invention for a certain period of time, during which they can commercialize the patent and generate revenues, which in turn serves as an incentive for promoting innovation. But at the same time, the patent holders have a public responsibility as well. their responsibility is to ensure that while they are holding the patent, they need to address the public requirement. They have to ensure that their invention serves a public purpose and benefits the society at large. And for this to happen, they will have to ensure that they work the patent or implement and commercialize the invention in the country where they hold the patent. And while working the patent and implementing the invention, they will also have to ensure that the invention is widely available to the public, that too at an affordable price. Since the two objectives are conflicting to each other, there naturally arises a dispute, and hence, in order to regulate them, at the global level, we have a set of standards and regulations that have been laid down by the World Trade Organization, and this has led to a set of WTO rules known as TRIPS, or the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. So based on these global standards set by the WTO, India has enacted its Patent Act in 1970. The Patent Act has also been amended to stay in line with the obligations of TRIPS, and under the Patent Act, we also have a set of patent rules that were notified in 2003. So under these Indian patent laws, the patent holder is given a monopoly over his patent for a period of 20 years. This recognizes their invention, it recognizes their effort, and gives them ownership over their invention. They can use this ownership to commercialize the patent, and this serves as an incentive for promoting innovation. But at the same time, the patent laws also places a duty or an obligation on the patent holder. The patent holder will have to ensure that the invention is worked within India or implemented within India in order to benefit the larger public. The patent holder also has a responsibility to ensure that the benefits of the invention is made widely available at reasonable prices. And in case the patent holder violates his responsibility and duty, then the government has the powers to revoke the patent or to issue something known as a compulsory license. Through a compulsory license, another company can be asked by the government to produce a generic version of the patented invention. These generic products are very vital in the field of healthcare because it helps the government to issue compulsory license when large pharmaceutical companies are violating their societal obligations by restricting the availability of their drugs by pricing them at a very high rate. In such cases, the government can take the compulsory licensing route and authorize local companies to produce the generic version of these drugs at cheaper prices. This is usually done in the case of life-saving drugs, which are often highly priced by the large pharmaceutical companies that hold the patent. And in order to detect this violation of the patent law and to identify the breach of the responsibility, the patent law mandates the patent holder to provide for full disclosure with regard to the extent to which they have worked and implemented their inventions within the country. Under this disclosure mechanism, we have a form known as Form 27 that the patent holder has to fill out every year, and through this annual reporting, they need to inform the government as to what extent they have worked the patent in the country or to what extent they have implemented their invention for the public benefit. They should also report on the revenue that they have made and provide data on the extent to which they have manufactured or imported the invention into the country. Previously, that is before the new amendment rules, they were also required to provide data on the quantum of manufacturing and import of invention into the country, and they were also required to disclose the licenses and the sub-licenses that they might grant to other companies, and they were also required to report whether they had met the public requirement by making their invention widely available at reasonable prices. So these three requirements that were a part of the disclosure procedure were vital to enforce the duty and responsibility of the patent holder, but unfortunately, the latest amendment rules, they have diluted these provisions and these requirements have been removed entirely. As a result of this latest amendment, Form 27 does not ask for any information from the patent holder on these three parameters, and without the availability of this information, there is no way for the regulators to identify whether the patent holder has violated his duty and responsibility towards the society. The author is of the opinion that because of the latest amendment, the disclosure policy has become an anti-disclosure policy, and it makes it very difficult for the regulators to identify any breach of responsibility by the patent holder, and thereby restricts the ability of the government to issue compulsory license for the production of generic drugs. See, the best example to understand the importance of full disclosure with regard to patents and the working of patents is the case involving an anti-cancer drug known as Nexavar. This anti-cancer drug was a life-saving drug that was produced by a global MNC known as Bayer. But this drug was inaccessible to the common man because of its high price. And through the disclosure procedure provided under Form 27, the government had detected that Bayer had breached its responsibility towards the society by pricing the drug at unaffordable rates. On the basis of this detection of the breach of its responsibility, the government decided to issue compulsory license to a domestic company known as Natco in order to produce the generic version of Nexavar. When India issued such a compulsory license, there was a protest by the United States and by several global MNCs because they felt that this was a breach of patent law and this was a breach of their monopoly. In fact, this issue has always been a source of dispute between the developed countries and the developing countries. And for a developing country like India, which faces severe healthcare challenges, the option of granting compulsory license is critical for ensuring public health. Now let's look at a column from page number 7. According to the writer of this column, the latest controversial farm laws that have been brought in further increases the gender divide in India's agriculture. See, available data shows that rural women play a critical role in Indian agriculture. According to this data, around 73.2% of rural women are engaged in farming activities. But despite this, only 12.8% of them own land. And this clearly highlights the gender divide in Indian agriculture, which is a direct result of our social, religious, and cultural practices which are inherently biased towards men and towards patriarchy and thereby undermine women's rights. Data from the India Human Development Survey report shows that 83% of India's agricultural land is held by male farmers, clearly indicating the bias against women. Our social, religious and cultural practices, they have all promoted male inheritance, thereby undermining the land and property rights of women. So this lack of recognition given to women farmers in India's agriculture and their lack of landholding rights ends up excluding them from the benefits of several government schemes as well. Because even the government and its policies, they have turned a blind eye towards this patriarchal exclusion of women from the agriculture sector. As a result, women farmers do not enjoy easy access to credit that is enabled by the government and by the national banks, and they are not able to enjoy the benefits of crop insurance, loan waivers, government subsidies, etc. This lack of recognition of their property rights further affects their socio-economic status as well, including their health and education. So the writer says that the new farm laws that have been brought out by the government was an opportunity to address women's rights, particularly the rights of women farmers. But unfortunately, the new laws doesn't pay any attention to this issue. And even the current ongoing protests against the new farm laws, they are entirely focused on the MSP issue and the possible corporatization of India's agriculture. Even the protesters and the farmer unions, they have not raised the issue of women farmers. And this systematic neglect of women farmers is going to further increase the gender divide in India's rural areas and as well as in India's agriculture sector. Now let's look at a few articles that can be important for prelims. On page number 7, we have a data chart that helps us understand how extreme weather events have increased in India over the last 20 years. This data chart refers to 3 particular disasters, that is floods, cyclones and droughts. This data chart helps us in understanding the most hazard-prone areas for these disasters. This understanding could be very important for a prelims question. So with regard to floods, the most affected districts in India are Chennai, Dibrugarh, Dhimaji, Golaghat and West Godavari. Then with regard to cyclones, the most affected districts are Chennai, Puri, Nellore, North 24 Paraganas, Ganjam, Cuttack, East Godavari and Srikakulam. Then finally with regard to droughts, the most affected districts are Anandpur, Bijapur, Chittoor, Chikbalapur, Gulbarga and Hassan. Then the vulnerability map presented over here also depicts the changing pattern of extreme weather events. As a direct result of climate change and global warming, the intensity, pattern and the nature of disasters are also changing. And as a result, a number of districts which were previously affected by drought, they are experiencing flood conditions today. And a number of other districts which were affected by floods, they are facing drought conditions. A classic example would be the arid regions of Rajasthan and Gujarat. These areas were previously affected by drought, but today they are experiencing flood-like conditions. Similarly, in the interior parts of southern India, especially in the interior parts of Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, districts which were experiencing floods, they have started experiencing droughts. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. The Food Safety and Standards Authority of India has placed a cap on trans fatty acids in oil and fat by amending the Food Safety and Standards Prohibition and Restriction on Sales regulations. As per these new restrictions, the food processing industry is mandated to limit the percentage of trans fatty acids in oil and fat to 3% by 2021 and bring this down to 2% by 2022. Currently, the limit on trans fatty acids stands at 5%. India began its fight against trans fatty acids back in 2011 when it placed a limit of 10%, and later this was brought down to 5% in 2015. So now, in line with the goal of the World Health Organization, India is placing further caps on the presence of trans fatty acids in oil and fat, and it is planning to bring this down to 3% and 2% by 2021 and 22 respectively. Because the WHO has called for the global elimination of trans fatty acids by 2023, considering their health risk. See, trans fats or trans fatty acids, they are found in a variety of food items, especially the ones that are produced by the food processing industries. So all types of industrial food is known to have trans fatty content, and regular consumption of high levels of trans fats is known to increase the risk of heart attacks and as well as lead to coronary heart diseases. So it's very important to pursue and achieve this goal of the World Health Organization, especially during the pandemic, because the pandemic is known to have a severe impact on those suffering from comorbid conditions such as diabetes and heart conditions. And since trans fats directly contribute to these non-communicable diseases, it's very important to eliminate trans fats from industrial processed foods. However, experts point out that this policy of the government is flawed because the current regulations apply only for oil and fat. They don't apply for other food items. Hence, experts have called for the elimination of trans fats in all types of food items and not restrict the regulations only to oil and fat. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, India has formally approved 2 vaccines for restricted use under emergency conditions. But opacity in government communication is dangerous when there is high vaccine hesitancy. Critically evaluate. The second question, the dilution of patent working disclosure rules hampers the effectiveness of India's compulsory licensing regime. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.